Welcome to Salamone, the podcast. With me, Michael Salamone. This week, it's Movember, No Shave November. And we're doing a tribute to Christopher Hitchens. Joining me is an old friend and an expert on the topic, Mr. Chad Parment. I'm Michael Salamone. This is my show. Yep. Welcome to Salamone. I'm Michael Salamone, and now the Sala Show. Hey, it's No Shave November, or Movember, which is a thing, and it's a thing about men growing our hair and beards out for the month for cancer awareness. The idea behind it all is to celebrate growing hair as so many cancer patients lose it, and to then remember those who have fallen to the disease. It serves as a month-long event to get men thinking about cancer awareness and cancer screening. One of the many greats that have fallen to cancer is Christopher Hitchens. Hitchens was a respected intellectual, a journalist who contributed to countless magazines, has his hand in over 30 books, and was one of the great social commentators of the times. Now, he fell due to complications due to esophageal cancer at the age of 62, December 4 years ago. 3 weeks before Hitchens' death, George Eaton of the New Statesman wrote, "He is determined to ensure that he's not remembered simply as a lefty who turned right, or as a contrarian and provocateur. Throughout his career, he has retained a commitment to the Enlightenment values of reason, secularism, pluralism. His targets, Mother Teresa, Bill Clinton, Henry Kissinger, God, are chosen at not random, but rather because they have offended one or more of these principles." This episode, we're going to unpack the work and life of Christopher Hitchens, take a look at how his polemics about American politics still carry relevance. And joining me for this conversation is a Hitchens fan, retired Marine officer, attorney, and lifelong friend, Chad Parment. Chad, thank you for being here tonight.
Yeah, hey, thanks very much, Michael. And on to Hitchens. I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
So, Chad, as I brushed up on my Hitchens for our conversation, I think one of the things I learned this time around is how many things are still in the current events zeitgeist. Are issues that Hitchens wrote about, some of them years and years ago. So let's start with, how would you explain Christopher Hitchens and the things he advocated to people tuning in who aren't familiar with him?
Well, I think the quote that you led with was a pretty good one. I think he was committed to reason and to dialectic. He had a long history of radical politics that was, for most of his life, I think for his entire life, was left of center. Certainly as a younger guy, he was a socialist and a Trotskyite. Gradually left those causes, but remained committed to the left. But I think more than anything, and sort of in the tradition of George Orwell, remained committed to reasoned argument and discovering the truth about things. I say that he remained a person of the left. He very famously, towards the end of his life and after 9/11, became a supporter of not only the wars in Iraq, but the wars in Afghanistan and sort of a more general war against Muslim jihad. And it led to a break with a lot of his former colleagues on the left, such as Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn. But as one of his critics from that period points out, he never really gave up his belief in some of these other liberal causes. He remained a fan of the New Deal. He remained a believer in a progressive system of taxation. He continued to believe that our involvement, American involvement against Allende in Chile was a disgrace. That our support for that the occupation of some of the disputed territories in Israel was a human rights violation. So he remained committed to a lot of these leftist causes, and I think that he saw his opposition to Muslim extremism and his support for the wars on terror during the Bush administration as an extension of that, rather than a turn away from it. But I just, I think one of the most incisive thinkers and one of the most incisive writers that we've had in a long time. One of those characters that, had he not existed, you would have to invent him. Here's someone who wrote on, freedom movements that other people were not aware of at the time and only became aware of later. He was an early supporter of the Solidarity movement in Poland. At the same time, he was a brilliant literary critic, and just, by all accounts, a charming dinner companion, just one of these sort of all-around men of the world that, if he hadn't really existed, you would have had to create him, sort of like a Gore Vidal or a William F. Buckley, larger than life.
And like a lot of great writers, kind of has a epic kind of character to himself, like a Hemingway or a Hunter S. Thompson. He had a personality beyond his writing, which made him a giant among his peers. You brought up a lot of topics that I'm going to want to touch on. I think where I'll start, though, is because it was early in his career that Christopher Hitchens kind of identified himself as a socialist, but throughout his career he was so critical of party politics. If you just wax philosophical with me, how do you think he'd feel about seeing a successful independent who identifies as a socialist running as a presidential candidate on behalf of the Democratic Party, or just even the overall success of socialist candidates in places like Seattle that we're seeing this year? How do you think Hitchens would wrap his brain around that right now?
It's hard to say. And he, as I was going through this, one of the things that I was struck by, I was rereading a lot of my favorite articles. I didn't, other than kind of going after Bill Clinton, he really didn't get engaged in American partisan politics, which is funny, because the first time I really felt his absence was it was pretty shortly after he died, but it was the Republican primary season for the 2012 election, and so I guess it was about this time in 2011. But as you just watched, Herman Cain was up, and then Newt Gingrich was up, and then Rick Perry was up, and they all lasted about a week, and then so as you just sort of watched this clown car progression of the GOP in that season, I remember thinking, like, what a time to have lost Hitchens. And if only I could have foreseen, what was coming at us 4 years later, I would have felt that loss all the more keenly. But, interestingly, it just wasn't a topic that he jumped into a lot. He preferred to write about these older writers. I think more enduring themes were what drew him. But I think that he would, in this political season, he would have had to respond. And I think in part because in the 2008 election, 2004 election, he identified himself as a Bush voter, which of course just made everybody nuts. But he he said, hey, I'm a single issue guy right now, and the issue is who's prosecuting the war on Muslim extremism the hardest, and I think that that'll be Bush. Well, I think part of the price he would have had to pay was, now he would have to answer for some of that, and he would have had to comment on at least the Republican Party primary and the things going on, at the tactical level in American politics. So I think that he would have been really excited to watch Bernie Sanders' candidacy for a lot of reasons. One, of course, here's a self-identified socialist, but also a guy kind of in the Hitchens vein who just won't tolerate disingenuousness. And I hesitate to say that about anybody who's been involved, about Bernie Sanders, who's been involved in politics his whole life. He certainly must have hedged here or there, but definitely a guy that's been saying more or less the same thing for his whole career too, right?
Yeah.
And of course you contrast that with, on the other side of it, Hitchens was a vehement opponent of not only Bill Clinton, but also Hillary Clinton. He considered them, as you have to, in many ways cut from the same cloth. I mean, almost, they've held themselves out as a political team. You get one for the price of two. Co-presidents was famously said when Bill Clinton first ran. And so, Hitchens had, as he himself said, an almost visceral hatred of Bill Clinton, I think, based on the facts and on what he had learned through investigating him. But that extended to Hillary, who's certainly aware of her husband's crimes and, has in many cases been complicit and in other cases turned a blind eye, and in several cases is guilty of a lot of her own crimes. So I think he'd at least be happy that there was a principled challenge on the left, to what's represented by the Clintons and corporate politics. Certainly, I think he'd be excited, and as much as I wish that he was back, I think that he hated to give up. No one is eager to pass away, I don't think, but I think he hated to miss out on these events more than anything else. I think he hated to miss out on his chance to comment on these things. So it's a shame that he passed on, but I think he'd be excited for sure.
When I was doing my research for this conversation, one of the things I stumbled upon that was quite relevant to what you just said about the Clintons, and with Hillary Clinton, it's been in the news a lot ever since those wacky 11 hours of Benghazi hearings, though what we keep hearing about Sidney Blumenthal, who I guess a thorn in the side of the White House was how much she was paying him as an advisor. But one of the things I dug up while researching for Christopher Hitchens is there's a connection there. It was really an affidavit from Hitchens and his wife that proved that Sidney Blumenthal had perjured himself on the topic of Monica Lewinsky that really made the impeachment of Bill Clinton possible. Of course, as you just discussed, Hitchens was one of the first to really criticize the Clintons for their corporate ties and the fact that the role he played in Bill Clinton's impeachment still has relevancy today through Sidney Blumenthal. Really kind of tickles me a little bit.
Yeah, and it's so as we were preparing for this, I asked myself, well, how did I first become aware of Hitchens? When did I first read him? Everything else, and it was that incident with him and Sidney Blumenthal, or that series of incidents, I guess, where him and Blumenthal had been friends, and in Hitchens' view, like so many other people, Blumenthal wound up being co-opted by the White House, and essentially went around smearing Monica Lewinsky and referring to her as trying to create this idea that she was a stalker who had pursued and basically blackmailed Clinton into this inappropriate relationship, which Hitchens just laughed. He said it's self-evidently ridiculous that the President of the United States could be stalked in the Oval Office. But it became relevant because, it was part of the obstruction of justice charge, right? If you're trying to intimidate a witness or give her the message that, hey, if you go forward with your claims, we'll destroy your reputation, then that's obstruction of justice. But of course, it's that's bad news, and it's nothing that Sidney Blumenthal should have been engaged in. But it's not the bombing of the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical facility or any of the other things that Bill Clinton, or Juanita Broaddus or anything else. The strange thing about when you mention Hillary Clinton and going after for Benghazi, so many of the scandals that they really try to get traction on aren't the things that they really ought to go after her for. But
agreed.
But so many of those things are just so much more difficult issues. They're more kind of in the gray area. I think the Clintons benefit enormously from they've participated in making politics a very dirty business, and now it becomes sort of a shield to them, where they can say, well, everybody's engaged in this, and everybody takes this money or whatever else. So, but not everybody does it so openly or willingly or happily as the Clintons, So it is, it's unsettling. But yeah, that was how I first came to Hitchens, was during that incident. And I was, at the time I was much younger. I was a Democrat. I was a supporter of the president. I did think it was ridiculous to continue to go after him, because of whatever had happened with this young woman in the Oval Office. And Hitchens was the first writer on the left that I really saw going after him. And that, caught my attention. Unfortunately, I'm as susceptible as anybody else to, discount. If I see something from Regnery Press, I tend to discount it. And if I see something from somebody that I know that I tend to agree with, I pay more attention. So that was, maybe the first time that I started to look at the Clintons in a different light. So not only introduced me to a great writer and thinker, but introduced me to the idea that maybe Bill and Hillary Clinton were not exactly all they were cracked up to be or held themselves out to be.
That's really interesting, because that's about the same time I became aware of Hitchens, and for similar reasons. I think the whole idea of the president perjuring himself bothered me, and I started to accept the criticisms of the Clintons, and he was one of the voices that came off with authority that maybe it's because, as you say, from the left, but that really got me to start analyzing my views about my own party as well as the other team. But I kind of want to move forward to what you brought up at the front of this broadcast of how, at least perceptually, Hitchens moved to the right to some folks over, as you said, against Islamic terrorism or extremism. He advocated for the war in Iraq and for strong military action on that. And I know that I remember people labeling him, and then, well, he's become a neocon imperialist. But not only as a Hitchens fan, you have a unique experience because you've served in Iraq, and you can put some perspective on things that myself and listeners like me, who really only got force-fed news items of what he was saying and what was happening on the ground. Any commentary there?
So in the introduction to one of his books, I think the collection of essays that was titled Arguably, he talked about sort of a conflict between the anti-imperialist left and the anti-totalitarian left. And I think that you and I probably grew up more familiar with the anti-imperialist left. And it was driven by, ideas about multiculturalism, and you wanted to root for the underdog. And, I wouldn't go so far as to say that this is the crowd that, that thinks America is always wrong, but I think that there are members of the crowd who probably do think that. And and so, they see some of the very negative things that the United States has done around the world and other Western totalitarian powers have done around the world. And they want to be on the side of the oppressed. And so, when we were in high school, the American left identified and supported the Sandinista regime in El Salvador. Well, I can understand not thinking that the Contras were all about light and truth, but there's no reason to go 180 degrees the other way and say, well, if the Contras are bad, then the Sandinistas must be good. Daniel Ortega was kind of a monster. There were certainly negative things happening under the Sandinista regime. Leftist regimes have done terrible things. There's no need to idealize some of these people or some of these groups that we view as having been oppressed by over-aggressive American imperialism. Just because you condemn the imperialism doesn't mean that that everybody else on the other side was a bunch of angels. And so he had a conflict there, and he said in the introduction of the book that he's really started to lean more heavily towards the anti-totalitarian left and to emphasize that. I think he was I wouldn't want to say when he finally came to this idea or when he really started to believe it, but I think that he would say that there's no accommodation with totalitarianism, and that Saddam Hussein's regime was a kleptocratic totalitarian regime, and you can't accommodate that. You shouldn't, and even if you try, it will ultimately fail, and you will ultimately have to confront that sort of regime or that sort of system. And I think his view was better sooner rather than later. He wrote an article in 2003 when he was by his own admission kind of tagging along at the rear of the invasion, which is no slight to him. I think he probably was attached to whatever unit they attached him to. But he said he had a sense of a meeting long postponed, and that it should have been. We should have forced Saddam Hussein out at the end of the first Gulf War. And of course, there were all these realpolitik reasons not to do that. But his point of view was that this guy was a totalitarian guy, and there was no way that he was ever going to moderate his behavior, and the 10 or 12 year interval between the end of the Gulf War and the beginning of the invasion of Iraq demonstrated that. He oppressed the Kurds and the Shiites in the south with chemical weapons and grievous environmental economic crimes designed to drive them out and essentially commit genocide. And so I think in a large part his support for the war in Iraq was it wasn't separate, but it was distinguishable from his opposition to Islamic extremism. But he probably felt that they were of a piece, that they were both forms of totalitarianism, and that they needed to be opposed. He was a longtime supporter of the Kurds as well. I think he was just drawn to people like the Cypriots or the Kurds or the Palestinians who were displaced ethnic groups without a homeland, or not necessarily displaced, I guess, but ethnic groups who had somebody else's homeland dropped upon them. And had no autonomy of their own, and he thought that those issues were important to be resolved. And if you look at where are all the hotspots in the world, many of them are on the dividing lines between those ethnic groups that have been subsumed into somebody else's country. And so, I think he had a reasonable point.
Well, and I think that relates to something you had said previously about how his views on war in the Middle East, we'll just call it, aren't separate from the other things he wrote and spoke about. He was anti-fundamentalist, whether it's religious fundamentalist or political fundamentalist. For instance, there's two issues that Hitchens wrote about that speak extensively to what I'm fond of and things I'm interested in pertaining to social justice. The first is drug policy reform. Hitchens was a huge critic of the war on drugs and a big advocate for legalizing marijuana, both recreational and medical. Critical of the prison sentences that go along with that war on drugs. And this is, of course, a hot-button topic right now. I mean, Bernie Sanders has introduced legislation to remove the classification of marijuana as a federal classified drug, and now steal the burn Hillary Clinton. It's come around with that as well as of this weekend.
Well, and she also, I'm sure you were about to mention this, but, of course, Bernie came out and called attention again to his opposition to the death penalty. It was brought up that he was the first candidate, I don't know, in 40 years who's run and has opposed the death penalty. And less than a week later, Hillary Clinton, couldn't quite come out and say that she was opposed to the death penalty. Came out and said she recognized, all the research and the facts about the inequitable imposition of the death penalty, and said that she thought it bore more study, right? As if the studies and the facts she had at hand were not sufficient. We need to, this raises some interesting questions for sure. Everybody that we put to death is black or brown, and, some horrific murders are committed by white folks with access to, better access to resources, and they never come close to getting the death penalty. I'm sure there are some white folks on death row, but in general, it's this is not my line, but it's a privilege of the poor.
Yeah.
So, steal the burn. She thinks that we should study it more closely, of course.
Well, I think, and this would work for Hillary Clinton because her positions do tend to be based on polls, I think opposition to the death penalty must be polling well, because The Daily Show had a piece on Republicans opposing the death penalty now because it's part of their pro-life position. So I think that maybe there's a movement there.
Well, and it should also be part of their small government position, right? Which is one of the terrible things about the Republican Party being in such disarray is that they do have some important things to say, right? Like, government can become too large. If it was all up to liberals, that may well happen. It can become a drag on the economy. It can interfere with individual freedom. So I think it's important that, we should have a party on the right that can make coherent arguments about smaller government and everything else. Well, what greater power could you give government than the power in life or death over citizens? Like, why should a conservative support that? It doesn't make sense. So, I think we're having a death penalty moment, a war on drugs moment. I'd like to say a gay marriage moment, but I guess it came and went in a very quick span of time. Still battles to be fought on that front, of course, but a lot of these issues are turning very quickly. So, Hillary would probably have to move fast on some of this stuff. Nothing but nimble, though. She's nothing if not nimble. So
she's doing a lot of 180s pretty effortlessly because she doesn't get challenged. But I do think Hitchens would enjoy all of that. The other one that I consider social justice, and you've touched on, is, especially as I keep seeing these images of children, Palestinian children brutalized coming out of Israel in the last few weeks. So he was vehemently opposed to Zionism, and as I kind of mentioned after you talked about Iraq, to me that's just more of that for lack of a better word, evangelical, anti-fundamental movement, and he was against seeing the Palestinians treated in the manner that is probably much worse now than even when Hitchens was writing about it. Now you've spent time in the region, and I haven't. Being a fan of Hitchens, do you see that what he is relating to the Kurds and his relating to the Palestinians as being similar?
He was. I think if there were oppressed people, he was going to go there and see what the conditions were, or if there, people who were reported to be oppressed or anything else, he was going to go and check it out and find out. And the Israeli, I got to say, I'm always sort of a casual observer of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It sounds almost awful to say, I guess, but it always strikes me as bizarre, and I think it struck Hitchens as maybe not bizarre, but sort of the inevitable outcome of a state based on a faith, and he saw that in at least two places. One was Israel and one was Pakistan, and I think he considered both of them to be failed states. Isn't exactly the right word. I guess ill-conceived states. He just didn't think it was the right basis for founding a state. He also didn't. He had quarrels with his homeland because they they persist in having a monarchy, even though it's largely ceremonial and basically just kind of fun to watch at this point. He thought that it did real damage. Adherence to bad ideas in whatever form, I think he thought it was corrosive. And so I think he thought the idea of a state based on a particular religion was a bad idea, and it was going to be inherently exclusive and prejudiced, and would just not deal with some of its citizens, or I guess in the case of Palestinians, not even its citizens, but its subjects, the people confined within its jurisdiction. It was going to deal with them in an unfair manner if they were not co-religionists. So I think that was probably a large part of the basis of his objection. And the other thing was he probably in his book God Is Not Great, he quoted a speaker that he had heard once, and I think it was an Israeli speaker, who said, look, the solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is completely obvious. Everybody knows what it is. You have two people both with legitimate claims to the same land. They are apparently incapable of living together. And so the solution is that they have to live separately in two separate states. Everybody knows this. Everybody's known it since 1947, 48. And the reason we can't get to that solution is that religion stands in the way on all sides. In Israel, the far right Orthodox Jews in that area refuse to give up any part of Israel. The Palestinian cause has been annexed to the cause of Islamic radicalism, and in the United States, you have far right fundamentalist Christians who would like to see the state of Israel extended from the Mediterranean to encompass the biblical province of the land of Israel given by God to the Jews, so that Jesus will come again, right? Like that will herald the second coming. So you have the three major monotheistic religions opposed to a two-state solution in Israel, and so, but for that, it probably would have happened by now. So I think that was another part of his opposition.
I think this is a good part to put a little disclaimer, though probably editorialized in. So as we're talking about these issues, we should note that, especially for folks who maybe aren't familiar with Christopher Hitchens, he, of course, was extremely anti-theology and a big part of why he was against both Islamic terrorism and Zionism. But his pragmatic writing on these topics still has relevance to people of faith who are against fundamentalism. I would view contemporaries of Hitchens like Dawkins and Bill Maher as fundamentalist atheists, but with Hitchens, I feel his anti-theology stance was more of another intellectual argument to discuss world politics. But still, for the benefit of listeners not familiar with him, I want to make sure that's on the table, especially if anyone goes on from this broadcast to read any of Hitchens' criticisms of Mormonism or any of the three Abrahamic religions Chad just mentioned. We talk about religion and theology a lot on this show because, like politics, these are systems that humans use for governance. As always, I want to be clear, I'm not using this outlet to endorse any theology, let alone agnosticism or atheism. I believe how a person governs their own belief system is deeply personal. I do, however, advocate for morality, and as we've discussed before on this program, in a most Darwinian sense. So with all those disclaimers laid out, Chad, let's talk about Hitchens and his advocacy of morality.
Well, yeah, and I guess I would just back up one second and say, I would agree with that. I'm a Christian myself. I don't think that it's necessary to be an atheist to agree with some of Hitchens' critiques of religion, and particularly his critiques of religion's involvement in politics. I think what he always said was that if religion was prepared to leave me alone, I would be prepared to leave religion alone. But he found that it in its mass form, it did have a tendency to try to insist. As to his morality, and this was sort of really where he maybe did become a conservative, or perhaps had always been. As I went through some of this and reflected on it, there were a lot of interesting aspects, interesting things that Hitchens did as a journalist that a lot of other journalists never did. He placed a lot of emphasis on psychological factors and the individual morality of the people within any movement or group. And so he was very adamant in identifying, say, sexual repression as both a hallmark and a cause of Islamic extremism and other forms of religious extremism. He became very committed to defending, and this is why I say he sort of became a conservative. He became very committed to defending, in the face of Islamic terrorism, what he termed barbaric nihilism, the culture of the West, the culture of liberal secular governments, the culture of the Western canon, which he knew very well and loved very much. I expect he was maybe surprised by this, but he sort of became a fellow traveler of guys like Alan Bloom, who had been saying for years that the West was giving away the best parts of itself by embracing this multiculturalism where, all cultures were equal, and actually some of the, like we should particularly disdain our own Western culture. He became a very committed defender of a lot of those principles, and he thought it was very important. Plurality, openness, all these sort of, they're almost soft values, right? Pluralism, openness, irony was one of his favorites. How do you mount a vigorous defense of irony, right? It's preposterous on its face, but he thought that those were the critically important things. He's also a big believer in the British virtues, right? His dad was a naval officer and who served during World War II, and he came up in post-war England, and he didn't talk about it much because he was British, but he very much admired and believed in the stiff upper lip and pluck and keep calm and carry on, get your job done without making a fuss about it. He thought that those were important. And, he wasn't above, he considered America over sentimental in a lot of ways. And, I remember one article after the campus shootings at Virginia Tech, the president of one of my alma maters, President Scorton at Cornell, they held a memorial on campus, and I forget the number of victims that the shooter killed at Virginia Tech, but during the memorial, President Scorton included the shooter himself as one of the victims, and Hitchens just found this distasteful. He recognized that the guy was severely mentally ill and should have had help and was probably not legally culpable, but he just thought that it was over sentimental, kind of claptrap, I guess, and he exhorted us to reserve our sentimentality for events that truly warranted it. And it sounds harsh, but I think he was looking to, the wars in Iraq that were ongoing at the time. I think he thought that the war against Islamic fundamentalism would go on for a very long time and will continue to go on, and that we needed to toughen up, I think was his view. But I just always, it was one of the things that was sort of appealing about him to me was that here was this lefty. He himself wasn't a very physical guy. He was a big drinker and smoker. He probably never ran a mile in his life unless he was chased by cops or something. But he was a big admirer of soldiers and soldierly virtues and courage and all that, the British virtues. Which, as a military guy myself, I appreciate it. I like the idea that those two things could be combined. A solid intellectualism and an appreciation for physicality and physical courage. I think he was a very moral guy, and he was committed to continually exploring his ethics and his morality, and it was why he was willing to change sides and change his position, I think, after 9/11. He considered it a hinge event after which the world had become different. It could no longer be viewed in terms of major powers versus minor powers and things like that. You had to start looking at a clash of civilizations, to borrow a term. And I think he believed that he was willing to say that Western values were superior, which I agree with, and also set him off from people on the left who were willing to live by them and live surrounded by them, but often unwilling to say, our values are superior. I think he thought the time had come to stand up and make some moral claims. I mean, what other journalist says that? He, makes those arguments or refers to Islamic terrorism as barbaric nihilism, which he did in at least one article and probably in other places. Other folks don't write like that. They don't say those things, no matter what side they're on.
Well, I would probably take issue with the bit on Western values. I am a sloth who very much respects service people like yourself that give so much to give us so much. And I think that's one of the reasons, not to keep bringing Bernie into this, that I admire people of his frame of mind so much, of that when a politician makes that decision to send service people into harm's way, I want them to really worry about it and really think about the people that are serving us as part of the argument.
Well, there's a bit of, there is a note of caution there when it comes to Hitchens as well. That because he grew up just post-war, and he said himself in interviews, he had I don't know if you listened to the conversation with Salman Rushdie, but he talked about growing up in post-war Britain, and all of the movies and all the reminiscences were about the finest hour, and you've missed it, right? And so he threw himself in all these other causes, the fight against the war in Indochina. He became a Trotskyite, all these other things. And after 9/11, I couldn't find the article again, but I know that he wrote it. The line was something like, and paraphrasing, of course, but could it be, finally a war of everything I love against everything that I hate. And so, William Manchester in his biography of Churchill said that, there's a sense and there's a concern that Churchill in his opposition, his early and vociferous opposition to Hitler wasn't really so much prescient as he was a St. George looking for a dragon to slay. And, Hitchens is open to the same criticism, that he had spent his life looking for the opportunity to measure up to the greatest generation, and had finally found it in this fight against Islamic terrorism. But that was, he was so overcome by the glory of it that he lost some of his objectivity and his careful consideration of things. Maybe. But I think he still got some of the larger things right. There were a lot of articles written that said, he said, hey, we got to go after Al-Qaeda. They're barbaric nihilists. They're fascists. They're totalitarians. And one of his critics quoted Michael Schur of the CIA, who pointed out, Osama bin Laden's declared causes are end of the occupation in the Palestinian territories, the U.S. out of Saudi Arabia, off the holy land of Islam, and basically, to stop interfering with that region. And that was an argument that I made to people at the time who said, oh, they hate our freedom, which was just so simplistic and silly. I said, look, this is a political group. They have real issues. We can, it's not necessarily our own fault. We didn't invite this attack on the terms that it came, but, they do have real political concerns. And I think, in some sense, Hitchens was prescient, and that he saw past all that, and he saw that what they were really about was this nihilistic vision of Sharia law and imposing the most strict, repressive, dead, humorless regime that they possibly could. And now when you look at what that group has become in ISIS, I think that's what I see anyway. I see barbaric nihilists. I think and I think I don't want to keep going. I don't want to drag this on too long, Michael. I keep referring back to my notes. I think that he was helped in seeing that by his time as a socialist and a Trotskyite, right? He had seen revolutions eat their own children before, and they had started out with these well-reasoned and fairly reasonable from their point of view political demands, and then devolved into just fundamentalist extremism, which can take a Marxist form or an Islamic form or a Christian form or anything else. And I think he foresaw that, and he knew that this enemy would become not a political enemy, but a civilizational enemy, a culturally based enemy. And that's how he approached it, I think, from September 12th on.
Well, I get that, and though I have minor disagreements, I do fear it in political extremism in our own country, be it the far Tea Partiers and the different secession movements that we've seen rear their heads the last couple of years. I fear it in the Occupy movement and the Black Lives Matter movement when I read people who really are calling for more than a political revolution, but a revolution that people, after not succeeding with political demands, take a more violent turn. But I want to touch on something else you mentioned briefly, because I think it's relevant if we're going to really look at the man. So at his death, I've got this here. Let me pull this note over. On his death, the Sunday Times described Hitchens as usually armed with a glass of scotch and an untipped Rothman cigarette. In 2003, Hitch himself wrote that his daily intake of alcohol was enough to kill or stun the average mule, and arguing that many great writers did some of their finest work when blotto, smashed, polluted, shit-faced, squiffy, whiffled, and 3 sheets to the wind. I want to read one more, this other quote from Hitchens himself. I always knew there was a risk in the bohemian lifestyle. I decided to take it because it helped my concentration. It stopped me being bored. It stopped other people being boring. It would make me want to prolong the conversation and enhance the moment. If you ask, would I do it again? I would probably say yes, but I would have quit earlier hoping to get away with the whole thing. I decided all of life is a wager, and I'm going to wager on this bit. In a strange way, I don't regret it. It's just impossible for me to picture life without wine and the other things fueling the company, keeping me reading, energizing me. It worked for me. It really did. So this isn't an unusual stance on substance abuse from a writer. And musicians and artists also embrace this, but we're talking about a writer. And Hitch spoke about this as being part of his process so earnestly. So Chad, as someone who's read so very much of his work, do you see the influence of being under the influence in Christopher Hitchens' writing?
Well, I mean, I've heard him say that, or I've read, his essentially the same point that you just quoted. I've heard him say it so many times that I think he must have at least thought it would be true. Steve Earle doesn't think it's true anymore, but have you bought any of Steve Earle's latest novels? I'm not sure. I think he liked to have fun, right? And so writing was entertainment to him. He said many times it was recreation, and the conversation was recreation. And so if another bottle of wine allowed the evening to go on a little longer, and you had, you could get Salman Rushdie to drop a few more memorable lines, after 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning that he otherwise would not have said, then it was well worth it, right? Because then Hitchens had a story that he could tell. He told over and over again, right? I don't know if you ran across it. One of my favorites was Rushdie was talking about why are all the titles to Robert Ludlum novels so portentous, right? The Born Supremacy and the whatever ultimatum. And somebody said, well, what if Shakespeare titles were, what if Ludlum's publisher had been able to Shakespeare titles, and so then it became a contest to come up with them, and it was, what would you call, what would Hamlet be if it was a Ludlum title? And Hitchens said that Rushdie immediately said the Elsinore Vacillation. And he thought, well, right. Well, you can't do that twice. And he said Macbeth. And he said the Dunsinane Deforestation. So, you and I have known each other a long time. I know that you're an appreciator of wit. So who would not stay up and drink another bottle of wine and stay up another hour later to have somebody come up with those two lines, just so that you could tell that story again for 20 years, right? So I think he was sincere. Whether or not how much of a help it really was to him, I guess it's always hard to say, but it's been attested to by, most writers that you and I admire, right? Who's your favorite sober writer?
I don't know enough about Steinbeck to know if he was sober. Yeah. I think this is a good transition for the point of the episode that I should bring up cancer and the reason that Hitchens is the subject of our No Shave November cancer awareness profile. Hitch died of esophageal cancer, and that's a type of cancer which comes with many warning signs, and it can be treated. A majority of this program's listenership is American, which means you may or may not have a fucked up healthcare situation. So still, I want to remind you that cancer is still a killer, but most forms are indeed treatable when found early. You can have a good success rate at beating it. There are many kinds of cancer screenings your healthcare professional can talk about and perform with you. So in this respect, please do not think like and be like Christopher Hitchens. Address your symptoms, get cancer screenings, beat this killer, encourage your loved ones to get their cancer screenings too. All right, moving on. Chad, if you had to sum up an overall Hitchens philosophy after this conversation to a listener that may not have been aware of him until now, how would you do so?
I think that he was someone that believed in truth, in finding the truth through dialectic and proper reasoning, and then in elucidating that truth through the proper use of the English language. And really that was probably what I most appreciated about him, was just the pleasure of reading him. There are many times that I agree with him. There are a lot of times that he made me laugh out loud, including in the essay that I read and then suggested to you that I think spurred this whole thing was As American as Apple Pie, which is it's got to be a 3,000 or 4,000 word essay published in the Atlantic on not just the pleasures, but on the ethics of oral sex. Fun and just an amazing writer. Even when you don't understand him, he writes about, he does book reviews on these authors that I've never read, right? I mean, how deeply aware and engaged in you are in Thackeray are you, right? But he writes these great essays on him, and because he just wrote so well, I don't know anything about the authors that he's writing about. I don't understand really the points that he's making about their writing, but he just had the turn of phrase, right? And so you've got to read him. So I think that brilliant, honest, and incisive, and just a pleasure to read. What else could you ask for from a journalist, right?
Yeah. Well, my final question to you is about another favorite author of mine. Chris Hitchens is often called the heir to Orwell, both for his love of the legendary political author, but also just for the parallels about, I don't know how to phrase it other than writing about the potential political paths to dystopia. Do you find Hitchens and Orwell similar?
I always did, and I am a huge fan of Orwell also. I've read 1984 and Animal Farm, of course, but I was always a bigger fan of Orwell's essays. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's just particular to me. I tend to be a fan of essays and I don't know if this is a term still used, think pieces in general. but maybe it's the British syntax that makes them seem so similar. Of course, Hitchens was a fan of Orwell. He wrote a book on Orwell called Why Orwell Still Matters, and did a very good analysis. And I just think they were both in the same vein of contrarians, trying to look at things from the outside, although Orwell was much more of an outsider than, Hitchens ever was. Orwell grew up in India, the son of a civil servant, spent some time as a civil servant himself. Hitchens was the son of a naval officer, but really never had any, he considered his parents Tories with nothing to be Tory about, and he never had any interest in service to the empire himself. And of course, Orwell served the empire briefly, but lost the taste for it rather quickly. So the different circumstances, but I think still very much a lot of the same approach towards authority and of their day, skeptical, contrarian, but determined to look at things honestly, I think, overall. Someone said of Orwell that above all else he hated a lie, and I think that is true of Hitchens as well. So I think they both came from that same place. And both just, how could you not enjoy reading their writing, even if you don't agree or you don't, Orwell, another writer who writes about things that now are just dated and you don't necessarily understand. Some of his essays continue to be relevant, but some of them were about, the Spanish Civil War, right? No longer necessarily usually historically relevant, but Homage to Catalonia it's worth reading just for the pleasure of reading it. So I think they'll both bear up on those terms. It's just fun to read.
Well, and as we've had this conversation, I think we've pretty well identified how Hitchens' writing is, and if not just his commentary, his editorializing, is still relevant to many of the issues of the day. And I would argue that the same is true for Orwell, if not as specific as what we've discussed with Hitchens, but to that same call of how do we govern ourselves through both politics and faith, and how does extremism influence that governance of humankind.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
My thanks to Chad Parment for this lovely conversation. Chad, I always feel blessed when I get to spend time with you. And my thanks to all of you who tuned in to give this a listen. This is Michael Salamone reminding you to get yourself a cancer screening and to please, please be good to one another. Cheers.
Salamone is a podcast taped live for a streaming internet audience. And archives can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, everywhere you find a podcast these days, and on michaelsalamone.com. Subscribe!